The property deed was sitting on my kitchen table the morning my son-in-law offered to drive me to the airport. I remember looking at it before I tucked it into the filing cabinet. 41 years I'd owned that house in Oakville. I bought it when interest rates were sitting at 18%, and my hands shook when I signed. My wife Patricia and I painted every room ourselves. We raised our daughter there. When Patricia passed 3 years ago, I stayed, because leaving felt like losing her twice. My daughter had been pushing me toward a retirement community in Burlington since the funeral. Not aggressively, not at first, just suggestions, gentle and reasonable. "Dad, the house is too big for one person. Dad, you'd have people your own age around. Dad, you wouldn't have to worry about the gutters." I always nodded and changed the subject. The gutters were fine. I cleaned them every October, same as always. That particular Tuesday morning in September, my son-in-law showed up at 8:30 with a coffee from Tim Hortons, and that easy smile he'd been wearing more often lately. He said he was heading toward the airport anyway, and it was no trouble at all. I had a flight to Halifax to visit my old friend Peter. A week, maybe 10 days. Peter had been after me to come since the spring. I thanked him, drank the coffee, and let him load my bag into his car. He talked the whole way there, mostly about the neighborhood, about property values, about how the market in Halton region had shifted. He said the word estate planning twice. I counted, I checked in, went through security, bought a Globe and Mail, and sat at the gate. Then I folded the newspaper, picked up my carry-on, and walked back out. I hadn't told Peter I was coming. There was no trip to Halifax. There never had been. I'd booked the ticket 6 weeks earlier using a travel credit I'd been sitting on. I checked in online. I did everything a person does before a flight, but I'd had a feeling I couldn't shake, the kind that sits in your chest and won't move regardless of how unreasonable it seems. 41 years of trusting my gut had kept me out of bad investments, bad partnerships, bad decisions. I wasn't about to stop now. I took the GO train back from Union Station and got off 2 stops before Oakville at Bronte. I walked to the Canadian Tire, bought a cheap pair of binoculars, a ball cap I'd never normally wear, and a prepaid phone. Then I called a cab to drop me at the park 4 blocks from my house. It was a Wednesday. My son-in-law should have been at his office in Mississauga. His car was in my driveway by 11:15. I sat on a bench by the ravine with the binoculars and watched. Not because I expected anything specific. I told myself I was being foolish, paranoid, a lonely old man with too much time, but I watched anyway. At 12:30, a second car pulled up, a silver BMW I didn't recognize. A man in his 50s got out carrying a leather folder. He stood at the front door for a moment, then my son-in-law let him in. I wrote down the license plate on the back of my Tim Hortons receipt. I didn't go home that night. I stayed at the Travelodge on Spears Road, paid cash, ate a sandwich from the vending machine, and lay on top of the bed cover staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about the way my son-in-law had carried my bag to his car that morning. Helpful. Eager. The way someone acts when they want you gone. My daughter called at 9. I let it go to the old phone, the one they knew about, and texted back that I'd landed fine, and Peter and I were having dinner. She sent a smiley face. I stared at it for a long time. The next morning, I called my nephew Malcolm from the prepaid phone. Malcolm is a real estate lawyer in Hamilton. We don't talk as often as we should, but he's sharp and he doesn't panic, and he has never once in his life told me what I wanted to hear instead of what was true. I told him what I'd seen. I told him about the leather folder, the BMW, the license plate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Give me the plate number." He called back in 2 hours. The car was registered to a man named Douglas Holt. Malcolm knew the name. Douglas Holt was a real estate agent who'd been reprimanded twice by RECO, the Real Estate Council of Ontario, both times for pressure tactics involving elderly clients. Malcolm's voice was careful when he told me that. measured, which meant he was more worried than he was letting on. "Don't go back to the house yet," he said. "I wasn't planning to. And don't say anything to your daughter." That one was harder to agree to. My daughter was 7 years old when she fell off her bike on our street and split her chin open on the curb. I carried her 6 blocks to the medical clinic because I didn't want to wait for the car to warm up. She held my hand the entire way and didn't cry once. She was braver than I was. I was terrified. When the doctor put in the stitches, she squeezed my fingers so hard I had marks for 2 days, and I never once complained about it. I kept thinking about that walk while I sat in the Travelodge watching the parking lot. Malcolm called again Thursday afternoon. He'd done some digging. Douglas Holt had been in contact with my son-in-law for at least 2 months. There were listings. Not public ones, quiet ones, the kind that circulate between agents before a property officially goes to market. Malcolm had found my address in one of those listings, listed as motivated estate sale, flexible possession date. My house. Listed for sale. Without my knowledge, without my signature. I sat with that for a minute. I'm not a man who cries easily. I didn't cry then. What I felt was something colder than sadness, something that required a very steady hand. I asked Malcolm what they would have needed. He said that to list a property without the owner's consent, they would have needed either a fraudulent power of attorney or a plan to pressure me into signing something I didn't understand. Given the retirement community conversations, given the airport trip, given the timing, Malcolm said very carefully that it looked like the second option. Soften me up, isolate me, get me to sign while I was overwhelmed or confused or just worn down enough to agree. "How long have they been working on this?" I asked. "Hard to say. At least since spring. Since Patricia's first anniversary." That's when the retirement community suggestions had started in earnest. I put the prepaid phone down on the bed and looked out the window at the parking lot for a while. "Here's what I need you to understand about my son-in-law. He's not a monster from a story. He's a man who coaches his son's hockey team on Saturday mornings and remembers to ask about my knee when we see each other at Christmas. He's charming in the specific way that makes you feel slightly off balance, never quite sure if the warmth is real or if you're just hoping it is. I had never fully trusted him. I had also never had a reason solid enough to say so. My daughter had chosen him. That had been enough. I called Peter in Halifax from the prepaid phone on Thursday evening. The real Peter, my actual friend, the man I'd worked beside for 22 years at the steel company before we both retired. I told him everything. Peter had known Patricia since before we were married. He'd flown in for the funeral and stayed 4 days. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about him. When I finished, he said, "What do you need?" "I need to know what she knows," I said. "I need to know if my daughter is part of this or if she doesn't know what he's been doing." That was the question I couldn't sit still with, the one that woke me up at 3 in the morning. The difference between my son-in-law making a terrible calculation on his own and my daughter standing beside him while he made it. Those were not the same thing. They could not be treated the same way. I needed to know which world I was living in before I did anything else. Malcolm was the one who found out. He has a contact at the brokerage where Holt worked, someone who owed him a favor. The listing had been put together by Douglas Holt and my son-in-law. The communication trail was between the two of them. My daughter's name appeared nowhere. I didn't feel relief exactly. What I felt was something more like grief, with a small opening in it. I went back to Oakville on Friday, not to the house, to the coffee shop on Kerr Street, where my daughter and I used to go on Saturday mornings when she was in high school. I texted her from the regular phone and told her I'd come back early, that Peter hadn't been feeling well, and could she meet me for coffee. She was there in 40 minutes. She looked tired. She'd looked tired for months. And I told myself it was the kids, the schedules, the ordinary exhaustion of a woman in her early 40s managing a full life. Looking at her across the table, I wondered how much of that tiredness was something else. I didn't ask about her husband. I asked about her. We talked for an hour about nothing in particular. The kids, her job, a trip she was thinking about taking. She ordered a slice of lemon loaf and ate half of it. When we stood up to leave, she hugged me for a long time. "I'm glad you're back," she said. "So am I said. I went home after that. The house was exactly as I'd left it. I walked through every room anyway, slowly, the way you do when you've been away, and you need to remind yourself that a place is still yours. The filing cabinet was still locked. The deed was where I'd put it. That evening I called Malcolm and told him to proceed. What followed took 11 weeks. I won't pretend it was simple or clean. Malcolm contacted RECO and filed a formal complaint against Douglas Holt. He also gathered the communications between Holt and my son-in-law into a package and brought it to a colleague who specialized in real estate fraud. The listing was pulled within the first week. Holt's license was suspended pending investigation. My son-in-law, when it all came out, didn't deny it. He sat across from my daughter in their kitchen and explained it the way people explain things when they've been caught. Not with remorse exactly, but with context. The mortgage on their house. The private school fees. The way he'd convinced himself that I wasn't really using the house, that I'd be happier somewhere smaller, that he was actually doing what was best for everyone. He had a version of events where he was almost reasonable. My daughter called me that night. She didn't say much. She said she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. We talked for 2 hours, which is longer than we'd talked on the phone since her mother's last months. The legal process is still ongoing. I'm told it will likely be settled rather than go to trial. My son-in-law has retained a lawyer. My nephew Malcolm is thorough and patient and more expensive than I'd anticipated, which somehow makes me feel better rather than worse. My daughter is still married to him. I don't have an opinion about that, or if I do, I've kept it to myself. She knows what he did. She's deciding what to do with that knowledge. It's her life, and she is not 7 years old anymore. What I'll tell you is this. I cleaned the gutters in October, same as always. I had Peter up from Halifax for a week in November. We ate takeout from the Thai place on Lake Shore and watched 3 hockey games and argued about the Leafs like we've been doing since the 90s. I slept well every night he was here. The house is still mine. The deed is in the filing cabinet where it belongs. Some mornings I make coffee and stand at the kitchen window and look at the backyard, the big maple that Patricia and I planted the year we moved in, and I think about all the things that have happened under that roof. The things you protect without knowing you're protecting them until someone tries to take them away. I trusted my gut. That's all it was. 41 years of trusting the feeling in your chest that says something is wrong before you have any evidence that it is. Patricia used to say I was stubborn. She meant it as a complaint. I've started to think she might have meant it as a compliment. The maple in the backyard is still there. Every morning I look at it through the kitchen window while the coffee brews, and I think about what it takes to keep something you've spent a lifetime building. What happened to me wasn't complicated, not really. A man made a calculation. He looked at my age, my grief, my empty house, and he decided I was someone who could be moved around like a piece on a board. He was wrong. But I've thought about why he was wrong, and it wasn't luck. When my nephew Malcolm laid out what had been done, the listing price, the quiet conversations between my son-in-law and Douglas Holt, I wasn't surprised by the greed. Greed is ordinary. What struck me was the assumption behind it. The assumption that I had stopped paying attention, that somewhere between Patricia's funeral and that Tuesday morning in September, I had become a man who no longer trusted what he felt in his chest. That assumption was the mistake. I've watched people make bad decisions my whole life, and almost every time the decision started with a small dishonesty. Not to other people, but to themselves. My son-in-law had told himself a story where he was practically doing me a favor. He'd convinced himself that what he wanted and what I needed happened to line up perfectly. That's not greed talking. That's something worse. It's a person who has stopped being honest about his own motives. The moment you stop being straight with yourself about why you're doing something, you've already lost something important, something that doesn't come back easily. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a retired man in Oakville who cleans his gutters every October. But I know that the reason I still have my house isn't because I was clever. It's because I was willing to sit in a Travelodge on Spears Road, eating a vending machine sandwich, and face the possibility that someone I'd trusted for 15 years had been working against me. That takes a kind of honesty that's uncomfortable. Most people prefer not to look. I understand why. It's painful to look at something directly when you're not sure you'll like what you see. What I know now, more than I did before all this, is that holding on to what matters requires three things working together. It requires knowing right from wrong and being willing to act on that knowledge, even when it costs you something. And in my case, it cost me a version of my family I'd been hoping was real. It requires using your head, not panicking, not reacting, calling Malcolm instead of storming up the driveway. And it requires the patience to see something through over 11 weeks when every instinct tells you to just confront the thing and get it over with. I think about my daughter often. She's navigating something I can't navigate for her. I love her the same way I always have. The grief I carry about her husband is separate from that, and I've learned to keep the two things in their own compartments. Patricia used to say the maple would outlast us both. She was probably right. Some things hold. You just have to be paying attention to which things those are.